It's Friday, it's the 4th of July. I'm Conn-young. This is ARIRANG News live from Seoul. Our top stories today. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping, on the second day of his state visit to South Korea, reaffirms his opposition to nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula in a speech to a group of university students in Seoul. And later this afternoon, President Park Geun-hye and Chinese President Xi Jinping will attend a Korea-China economic forum to meet with hundreds of business leaders from both countries. And Japan lifts some of its sanctions on North Korea as Pyongyang announces the details of a new probe into the fate of at least a dozen Japanese nationals believed to have been abducted by North Korean agents in the 1970s and 80s. Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping spent his second day in Korea, underscoring his country's commitment towards ties with Seoul in meetings with South Korean lawmakers. And later this afternoon, Presidents Park and Xi plan to make their case to businessmen from both countries at an investors' forum. Well, let's find out what more is on the Chinese leader's itinerary for the remainder of his state visit here. Our presidential office correspondent Choi You-sun is live on the line. You-sun.
Conn-young, Chinese President Xi Jinping, who met with Korean National Assembly Speaker Ui-hwa earlier this Friday, responded positively to Chung's proposal to set up a trilateral historical research committee with Japan, emphasizing the need for the three Northeast Asian neighbors to share the same historical perspectives. The speaker talked about a three-nation committee that would one day jointly publish school texts. To that end, the Chinese leader said the committee would serve to correct historical misunderstandings involving the three countries. The comments come at a time when the Abe administration in Tokyo continues to deny its imperialist atrocities. And Beijing, locked in a bitter territorial dispute with Tokyo, has been pushing for more cooperation with Seoul on historical issues. Chung then expressed his hopes to invite his Chinese counterpart Zhang Dejiang to Seoul, to which President Xi said he plans to suggest to Zhang more frequent exchanges and active dialogue between the two parliaments. The big event today will be the two countries' Economic and Trade Cooperation Forum, where both leaders will address some 500 Korean and Chinese officials and businessmen. President Park will stress the need to diversify bilateral cooperation from its current focus on the manufacturing sector. She will also propose Seoul and Beijing work together toward realizing her Eurasia initiative of linking energy and logistics infrastructure across the continent. And before the forum, President Park hosted China's first couple for a luncheon to further showcase the amicable relationship between Seoul and Beijing. Just before wrapping up his Seoul visit today, President Xi will meet with Chinese residents here in Korea. I'm Choi You-sun reporting on President Xi's state visit to Seoul, and I'll be back with an update in our next newscast.
Well, the Chinese president also spent this Friday morning addressing a group of students at one of Korea's major universities. There, he emphasized the strong ties between South Korea and China. Here's our Kim Young-gil with this report.
Chinese President Xi Jinping paid a visit to Seoul National University on Friday to address 500 members of the student body. It was the first speech by a Chinese president at a Korean university. During the address, President Xi said Korea and China will continue to strengthen their bilateral ties through their strategic cooperative partnership. He also said that both countries could deepen their mutual understanding by diversifying their cooperation in the cultural arena.
China will open up a new horizon in China-Korea relations as China will pursue peace and cooperation between the two countries. China and Korea must cooperate in order to open up new opportunities. We will strengthen cultural exchanges in the humanities and liberal arts. This will help foster friendly ties among the people of both countries.
The Chinese president went on to say that Korea and China have been able to overcome difficulties in the past with one another's help, and said he hopes the two countries will continue to strengthen their strategic cooperative ties. He said Korea and China are each other's closest partner, biggest investor, and most favored place for travel, which has led to rapid growth in Korea-China relations. Regarding North Korea's nuclear program, President Xi said South and North Korea should sit down for talks and find a peaceful solution for denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Chung, ARIRANG News.
Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping has also proposed a joint commemoration with Korea, marking the 70th anniversary of two events in 1945. China's victory in the Second Sino-Japanese War and Korea gaining independence from Japan. Well, China's Foreign Ministry announced Friday that during the Seoul-Beijing summit, President Xi said it was possible that Korea and China could hold commemorative events together next year, marking the 70th anniversary of the two milestones. When asked about the proposal, Korea's presidential office spokesperson did not give a clear answer, saying he could not confirm specific details of the summit. In meetings with world leaders earlier this year, President Xi is known to have emphasized that 2015 marks the 70th anniversary of China's war of resistance against Japan. So FTA talks are expected to gain momentum between South Korea and China as the leaders of both countries agreed to accelerate efforts to remove tariffs on each other's products. Well, China is Korea's biggest export market, while Korea is China's third largest trading partner. Our Song Ji-sun reports on the impact a free trade deal could have on Korea.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a joint post-summit press briefing with President Park Geun-hye on Thursday, emphasized their will to wrap up negotiations for a bilateral free trade deal by the end of this year. Delegations from the two sides, who have already held 11 rounds of talks, will try to hammer out their remaining differences later this month. The two leaders expect the free trade deal to increase two-way trade to $300 billion next year, from $230 billion in 2013. With shipments to China accounting for 1/5 of Korea's exports, the finance ministry expects Korea's GDP to rise by up to 3% over the next 10 years after the FTA takes effect. Korean automakers will benefit the most, as the free trade deal is expected to gradually remove the 22.5% tariff China levies on foreign cars. But Korea's agriculture and fisheries industries could be slammed by an influx of cheap Chinese products, with some exports predicting an annual output fall of some $3 billion. The Korean side wants to exclude as many agricultural products as possible by designating them as extremely sensitive items. Farmers here have urged the government to draw programs to compensate for an expected surge of Chinese products that already take up the lion's share of imported food. If Seoul and Beijing successfully conclude the trade pact, Korea will have established free trade deals with the world's three most influential economic powers: the US, the European Union, and China. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News.
Well, a U.S. specialist on Korean affairs says that South Korea-China summit was a constructive one overall, but were largely critical of the two countries for failing to bring about a groundbreaking deal on the North Korean nuclear issue. Experts, including Victor Cha of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, pointed out that the two countries hold fundamentally different views on the North. Cha said Beijing has made a tactical shift, but it has yet to make a strategic one. Well, another expert on North Korea, Joel Witt of the 38 North website at Johns Hopkins University, says China may have intended to send a political message to Pyongyang through the summit, but it remains unclear whether Beijing has undertaken any substantive changes on how it handles the communist state. Now, after months of government-level talks, the Abe administration is keeping its promise with North Korea and has lifted some of Japan's sanctions on the reclusive regime. And this in return for a reinvestigation into the fate of Japanese citizens abducted to the North decades ago, which will be led by North Korea's most powerful organization. Our Hwang Sang-hee has this report.
Following a cabinet meeting Friday, Japan has formalized its decision to relax sanctions against North Korea. The sanctions were unilaterally imposed on North Korea by Japan and include travel bans to and from Pyongyang, restrictions on how much money can be sent or brought into the communist state, and port calls by North Korean ships to Japan. This after North Korea formed a special investigative team to determine the fate of several Japanese citizens abducted by the North decades ago. The committee, to be led by North Korea's most powerful National Defense Commission, will get to work starting Friday. Tokyo may further ease sanctions on Pyongyang after the first preliminary report on the investigation is released sometime between late summer and early fall. In 2002, North Korea admitted to abducting 13 Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s to help train their spies, but Japan believes even more people were kidnapped. Those observing the two neighbors' recent overtures are wary of the growing intimacy between them. In a statement Thursday, U.S. State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki reiterated that Tokyo maintained transparency in its dealings with North Korea, so the denuclearization efforts of Japan and its allies, namely South Korea and the United States, remain intact. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
All of the day's important events close to home and around the world. Join Conn-young live from Seoul.
Mobile shopping market for the dual use of the Korean name East Sea and the Japanese name Sea of Japan in school textbooks. Well, K-pop makes its popularity across the globe, but now it may be Korean cuisine on the U.S. president's dinner table. U.S. President Barack Obama's personal chef has come to Korea on a very special mission to learn how to cook temple fare. Sam Cass, the senior policy advisor on nutrition at the White House and an advocate of organic food, paid a visit to a Jingwansa temple in northern Seoul, where he learned the secrets behind some delicious Korean summer dishes. Well, the Buddhist monks at the temple taught the chef how to make a cucumber water kimchi, kongguksu or cold bean noodle soup, and other very delicious dishes. Well, after the cooking class, Cass said he would prepare the healthy summer dishes he learned during his trip for President Obama, who also asked him to learn how to make bulgogi. And let's shift our focus to the arts scene. Legendary ballerina Kang Soo-jin may have assumed the top position at the Korean National Ballet Company earlier this year, but that doesn't mean she's hung up her ballet slippers just yet. Well, she is set to star in a special ballet created just for her that has its Korean premiere this weekend. Our cultural correspondent Park Ji-won sat down with her to talk about the production and the two very demanding roles that she has recently taken on.
This will be one of the few chances to see legendary ballerina Kang Soo-jin perform before her planned retirement from the stage in 2016. So this weekend's ballet Madame Butterfly, which was made and choreographed just for her, is a must-see production.
How I interpret my butterfly is how I am actually. All my color can come out in this Madame Butterfly as a woman.
She says the main character Choi You-sun has many different facets, from purity and sensitivity to charismatic strength, which all reflect her personality. When asked how she handles two demanding jobs, director of the National Ballet Company and a performer, she says she enjoys doing both.
Being on stage dancing, it's my food, because I always danced because I loved it. Being director is another thing, I love it. It's such a challenge for me and very important with all the dancers, all the workers. I think to breathe together, to have the same tempo and same mind, that it can bring the success. And I do have this feeling with the National Ballet.
The choreographer of this new classic ballet says the production would not have been made without Kang. And when the ballet premiered in Austria last year, all the performances were sold out.
We did it with love for what we do, with passion. It was very nice for everybody, and I'm happy about the result. And I hope that the love that we had doing this production, the public in Korea would feel it also.
The ballet runs from Friday to Sunday at the Seoul Arts Center. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Well, let's shift you from classical arts to more of a modern art scene. Blockbusters and thrillers have been invading the marquees this summer, but there remains one film genre, a fixture of the season actually, that has yet to show its face until now. Korean cinema is known for its horror films, and every summer, movie lovers look to beat the heat by getting their chills in the theater. K-horror, as it's better known, may no longer be in its heyday, but year after year, a fresh set of local horror films are unleashed on the public. I mean, yesterday we saw the release of 2 new K-horrors, and here to chat to us about those and the history of the genre, as well as its current state within the industry, is our very own film critic, Piers Conran. So Piers, let's jump right in. It's scorching hot. I mean, it was very hot today as well. And there's no better way to cool off the heat than to watch movies that send chills down your spine, right? And I remember back in the 90s and even early 2000s, it was more of Japanese horror films that we turned to. But then in the recent years or so, we saw the K-horror rising to fame, and then I no longer see it anymore.
It's true that K-horror kind of piggybacked on the success of what's known as J-horror, Japanese horror, back in the late 90s. Typically films like The Ring or The Grudge or Dark Water, which were all remade in America. These styles of films, kind of ghost-driven narratives, which kind of really potent scares. A similar style started to emerge in Korea in the late 90s. In fact, there was a Korean version of The Ring called The Ring Virus. But Korean horror cinema is much older than that. It goes all the way back to, I mean, in the 60s there were a number of horror films, even in the 50s. There's a tradition of films, the Kumiho films, I think. That's the five-tailed fox, I think. So there's a whole series of those. Nine-tailed fox, sorry, that's right. And so what we have in Korea particularly, as we see on the backdrop here, are a lot of high school girl films. So these kind of haunting films where a high school girl dies and she comes back and haunts her classmates. So we're seeing a lot of that.
Well, so what are some of the must-see Korean horrors that that I might have missed out on?
There's quite a few horror films made in Korea. Horror is a tricky genre because you're not going to have a surefire success of a horror film. A lot of them are not very good sometimes, but Korea has some really excellent ones. From 15 years ago, we have Memento Mori, which is the second in the Whispering Corridors series, a very famous series with 5 installments of these kind of high school films. This one featured lesbian themes, which was kind of a big deal in 1999 in Korean cinema.
Right, I'm actually surprised that they actually made a film about that back in the 90s.
Right, and this was a very good one. It's very well regarded around the world, and also relating to current news, it's directed by Kim Tae-young, who recently announced his engagement to the Chinese actress Tang Wei.
Well, he's now better known, I suppose, because
yes,
of that.
Yes, he is, and very good for him. He's a really, really nice guy. And then we have perhaps the most famous Korean horror is A Tale of Two Sisters by Kim Ji-woon, who's made a lot of famous films. And this one, it's a very, very well-made film. More recently, we have Possessed from 2009, kind of a shamanism horror, which is a little less well-known, but is a really excellent film. The same director made Architecture 101 2 years ago.
Oh, okay. Very different genres, right?
Completely
the two completely different. Wow. So, but how are K-horror doing these days?
Well, as you mentioned, you hadn't heard of much going around recently, and that's simply because they're not doing very well. I mean, there's probably a number of reasons for this, but essentially we see a few films released every summer, something like 3 or 4, but they're getting kind of increasingly low returns, and save for some, a modest success like last year's Killer Tune, they're really not doing very well.
Right. Do you have any theories as to why this might be happening? Why there hasn't been a big rise in K-horror these days?
Well, one of the reasons that I think that Korean horror and Japanese horror started to do quite well 15 years ago is that was the same time that Hollywood horror started to kind of lower its production values. Films like the Blair Witch Project came around, so all these found footage, really cheap films were made. Some of them still made money, but there was still a thirst for more well-made stuff, and so we have that in Korea. But now they've started to go that way as well. We're seeing more of these found footage things, these kind of TV-style horror films, and I don't think audiences are responding quite the same way. Notice that last year, one of the most successful films of the year was The Conjuring, a very well-made Hollywood horror film.
Right.
Far more successful than any Korean horror in many years.
And do we see perhaps a lack of talent there as well?
Yeah, you know, there used to be some big talent used to be attracted to horror films, you know, early Ha Ji-won films, for instance. But these days, we're not seeing any big stars or even any big directors. And with the directors, that's a really sad thing. Horror cinema around the world is well known to be kind of a showcase for young talent. And while we're still seeing first-time directors making horror films in Korea, they're in the current market. They're not afforded the same kind of freedom that filmmakers have been in the past in Korea. So we're seeing films that are not so much half-baked as unrealized. So it's kind of this potential is there, but it's not given its fair due.
So with that in mind, what does this summer's batch have in look like? I mean, how do you think they'll do?
Looking back against the last few years and this year, I don't know that we're going to see any very successful horror films this year. We have 3, so far as I can tell. 2 of them released this weekend. Now, the first of those is Morning Grave, which was released yesterday. It's by the debut director Chun, who is a very promising short filmmaker. He's got this great style, and he's kind of brought this style to this film. It's more of a horror comedy in certain ways. It looks like a horror, but it's definitely got a lot of comedy going for it. And that would kind of work in its favor because some of the most recent successes include Hello Ghosts and Spellbound, which are horror comedy hybrids. And other hybrids, we have like the horror thriller last year, Hide and Seek. So kind of mixing things up tends to get the audiences in a little more. We also have Navigation, which is a found footage horror. Some obnoxious kids go on a road trip. They come across a car crash and they take the navigation system. It brings them to bad places. I haven't heard very much about it, but going by the premise and the style of the film, it certainly doesn't appeal to me, and I don't know that it will to the wider public. The last one is Tunnel 3D, which will premiere at PFAN, the Pucheon International Fantastic Film Festival, in 2 weeks, and so we don't know much about that one yet.
But do we have higher expectations for Tunnel 3D than others?
Well, Tunnel 3D is a little, I guess, higher profile. It has a bigger company behind it. It has some minor stars in it, whose names escape me at the moment, some young stars. And of course, it is getting a world premiere at PFAN. So PFAN, you know, is a great event.
Right.
So we could hope for something there. But at the same time, a few other horror films have premiered at PFAN in the past. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see something incredible.
So, you know, to say the least, you don't sound too optimistic about the Korean horror film market here. What do you think is in store for the near future, or if long term, perhaps?
I mean, I love Korean horror cinema. There's many examples that I really like, but it's true that recently I don't think the industry has given fans something to kind of really chew on. That could change. What we're seeing, the horror by itself is still popular, but it's working better in these hybrids, these horror comedies, horror thrillers. It's working as an element of a film rather than the whole thing itself. So, but I hope that we'll see more stuff going on in the independent scene, because then maybe we can get some more innovative stuff like we're seeing around the world, really low budget, new filmmakers coming in outside of studios and making really incredible stuff. So perhaps that would be a way of reviving the genre in the country.
Do you think it's maybe that, you know, these days where the public, we've been, you know, exposed to so much sensuality and so much, you know, shock in real life anyways, and so that nothing, you know, really like stimulates the horror or fear in us anymore?
Well, I think that's certainly possible to a point, but certainly speaking for myself, whenever I see a horror film, I still cower, I still have to hide and, you know, close my ears. So it still has this kind of elemental effect. I think, you know, if you do it well, and there are some filmmakers who can do it well, you can still harness that power. And so I think it's a question of the right film hasn't come along in a while.
Well, I'm not a very big fan of horror films. I probably will never watch one, but I certainly hope that there is a boom in that industry as well. All right, Piers, thank you so much for this week, and we will see you next week.
It's been a pleasure.
Good afternoon. The air is very refreshing after the rain from yesterday, and currently the monsoon rain is taking a break here in Seoul. But there is a layer of fog hovering over the nation due to the high pressure trough, and we can expect about 5 to 20 millimeters of sudden showers down south. And the daytime highs has gone up into the 30s in some regions, and although we have cloudy skies, the sun is very strong with high UV levels, so make sure to apply sunblock before heading out. Now going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will top out at 32 this afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will peak up to 26 and 27 degrees. And moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops over to 25, Dokdo at 23, and Mangungang tops into the mid-20s. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
Well, that's all for now, but I'll see you back here at 4 p.m. Korea time.